Can the new Apple Silicon chips handle professional 3D sculpting work in ZBrush? What about using them for doing 3D print work? Now, Apple has unleashed the M2 Pro, Max, and Ultra, promising even more power and efficiency. And in this video, we're going to be comparing it to the new M2 Max chip in the MacBook Pro, comparing it to the M1 Max from the Mac Studio that I had, to see how much of a difference there is and whether or not it's actually worth the upgrade. So stay tuned as we delve into the real-time viewport performance, Blender cycles, GPU rendering, ZBrush decimation speed, and overall sculpting experience on these new Apple Silicon chips. Hi, my name is Thaddeus. I'm from Curious Creative Media, and I hope that I can help you create something awesome today. Let's talk a little bit about the problem with YouTube gear reviews before we start off. As an upfront disclaimer, I am not a professional gear reviewer or YouTuber. This video is not sponsored. I bought all of this stuff myself, and I'm simply a guy who is using this gear in my own business for professional use and sharing my own experience in hopes that someone else might find it useful. Since I know the stress of wading through all the sea of career YouTube reviewers who just run a bunch of benchmark tests, but you're not really sure if they've ever actually used it for professional work in industry. There's been a ton of review videos already benchmarking the M2 chips. However, I actually found that sometimes these YouTube tech reviewers get things wrong as they just run these benchmarks on the gear, but actually don't use it long-term in professional production. Now, benchmarks have their place, don't get me wrong, right? But they're different from actually using the gear for real-world work. So let's talk about why I'm choosing a Mac over a PC, right? We all know that the PC crushes it when it comes to GPU performance, especially with NVIDIA's monster video cards like the RTX 4000 series, right? There's simply no comparison. And as great as these Apple Silicon chips are, they simply aren't going to compete with the raw performance of such beastly kind of cards, right? So if you're looking for amazing GPU performance for gaming or for real-time development work for video games, or just to, have spec bragging rights, then go buy and build or build a PC. However, if you're watching this video, you probably are a Mac user or a potential Mac user who's looking at the M2 chips for other reasons. And there's some things about the Mac ecosystem and the MacBook Pro which appeal to me, other than just raw performance, such as, for example, portability and efficiency, right? You can actually do work on a MacBook Pro all day unplugged. Secondly, they're quiet. I love how silent they are. Sitting on my desk, I do a lot of podcast recording, and having something that doesn't sound like a jet taking off from my desk is really important to me. Thirdly, Mac OS, right? I actually like the feel of the Mac OS, as well as many of the features that it has. It just feels a lot more creator-friendly than Windows, in my subjective opinion anyways. Also integration with my iPad Pro, right? And it's so cool to be able to sketch in Procreate or sculpt a concept on Nomad 3D on my iPad and then just drag it over to continue on my MacBook. By the way, being able to sculpt an iPad from like a couch is pretty cool, and let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a video on my workflow with that later on. And their build quality, right? Everyone has to admit that Apple at least makes great laptops that look, feel, and function great. Plus, I've yet to still find another laptop trackpad that I can actually use to get work done and not feel totally handicapped without a mouse. All that to say that there are a ton of other reasons why someone might choose to buy a Mac over a PC and vice versa. So here are the specs for the computers that I'll be comparing. First up, we have the M1 Max Mac Studio unbinned version with the 10-core CPU, 32-core GPU, 16-core neural engine, 32 gigabytes of unified memory, 1 terabyte SSD. Right? And secondly, the other computer that we're comparing is the new Mac that I'm replacing my Mac Studio with, which is the 16-inch MacBook Pro M2 Max with the 12-core CPU, 38-core GPU, 16-core neural engine, 32 gigs of unified memory, and a 1 terabyte SSD. So both of them are unbinned versions of the M1 and the M2 Max chips with otherwise similar sort of specs. The main difference is that one is a studio desktop and the other is a laptop, which may have some implications on the thermal performance. So let's start off by comparing how the M1 and the M2 Max chips do in rendering stills in Blender. For this, I decided to go with my thing model for consistency, since that's what I used in my previous video. And it's a game model that I built with normal mapping and textures at 4K resolution. The M1 Max chip on the Mac Studio, we saw great viewport performance. It was able to rotate around the model and do all of the tasks that you would need to do in the Blender viewport with no problem. Similarly, on the M2 Max on the MacBook Pro, there was no slowdown in the viewport and both handled it flawlessly. So if you're looking primarily at doing similar sort of character work that I'm doing, then you're not gonna have any problems with either of these in the viewport anyways. However, if you are working with heavier models, and I think that the M2 will perform slightly better than the M1 due to its high efficiency, more CPU and GPU cores, but it's not gonna be a crazy jump in my opinion. After all, the M2 is really just an overclocked M1 with a few extra bells and whistles and a few extra cores. So I don't think that it's necessarily a strong enough reason for upgrading if you already own the M1 Max. So what about the rendering itself? Doing a full body render of the model in 4K UHD using cycles with the GPU and samples turned up to 1024, the M1 Max took 1 minute 33 seconds on its first render, and then 1 minute 29 seconds on the second, and 1 minute and 32 seconds on the third. So it averaged about 1 minute and 32 seconds per frame. Not bad. But obviously, if you're going to be doing a lot of rendering, you'll really benefit from an RTX 4000 series card that's going to throw a lot of muscle power at it. But if you're just doing light rendering stuff for your personal demo reel, etc., then maybe the M1 Max might just be fine. Once you can control your heart's temptation to envy. Now remember, playing the comparison game is a joy killer, okay? Let's talk about the M2 Max rendering. Now, loading up the same project in the M2 Max MacBook, it had the same great viewport performance and it averaged about 1 minute and 25 to 30 seconds per frame. So not really a huge jump, but there was a little extra power with the extra cores on the M2. Now, I wouldn't say though that it was life-changing, but if you're rendering a lot of frames, those few seconds could add up. What was surprising to me was that in some other render scenes, the M2 Max actually was slower than the M1 Max. And I think that this may have been because some performance throttling in the laptop version of the chip. But I can't really be sure on those other tests since I wasn't as exact in setting up the scenes the same way on both machines. And unfortunately, I've already sold the Mac Studio. However, for me, I'm pretty content with the results that I got. And if I ended up needing more rendering horsepower for my professional work, I'll just invest in a PC rig. But for now, for just showing still renders of 3D sculpts for print, which is my main work currently, both the M1 and the M2 were fine for me. And that might be different for you depending on the work that you do. Let's talk about the ZBrush Performance. So just how much can these Apple Silicon chips handle in ZBrush? What would happen if you push ZBrush sculpts to the max with the high frequency details and high poly count, right? So let's first look at the M1 Max sculpting. I loaded up my ZBrush sculpt of the thing, and since I used it for doing my render tests in my last video, I figured it might be helpful for some comparison. The model is only 29 million polygons in ZBrush, so nothing crazy, right? The head is about 5 million polygons, and sculpting on it is smooth, like a hot knife through butter, right? But that shouldn't really surprise anyone. After all, even the most modest of the computers these days can handle that. So I subdivided the head as high as it would go to 95 million polygons on a single subtool mesh. Right? ZBrush actually limits you to 100 million polygons per subtool by default. And then I tried sculpting on it with the Mac Studio M1 Max, and it stuttered a little bit and was a little bit laggy, but it actually ended up being workable if you needed to do something crazy like that. And then I subdivided all the other subtools to max out the model at 362.8 million polygons. Now, I'm not sure when I'll ever need to have a ZBrush model this high poly, but hey, why not, right? YOLO. As expected, it was very laggy, but it worked. I was able to drag out an alpha and to sculpt. However, the rotation around the model was pretty slow, and I wouldn't recommend working like this. This was pretty respectable performance in my opinion, and it made sense since ZBrush mainly uses your RAM and your CPU and the Max Silicon chips with their insanely fast unified memory and the great CPU performance actually handled pretty well. There's not much advantage to having a beefy RTX card in ZBrush anyways. The real difference is going to be all in the RAM and the CPU, right? That's what it's dependent on. Let's talk now about the M2 Max sculpting experience. So I loaded the exact same model into the M2 Max MacBook Pro and did the same test. Now, obviously, sculpting on the 5 million polygon head was a breeze, and sculpting on the 95 million polygon head after subdividing it to its max was also very smooth on the M2 Max. Definitely, it felt better than and smoother than on the M1 Max. However, once I started subdividing the other subtools to the max, I actually started seeing some of the differences. I subdivided the other subtools until they hit that same high poly limit of 362.8 million polygons in the scene, but the performance actually seemed quite a bit more laggy on the M2 for some reason. And this was when I started looking at the monitoring app that I have and saw that it seemed like the CPU and the GPU weren't actually being maxed out. ZBrush mainly uses CPU, so I was expecting the M2 Max to do at least as good or better than the M1 Max. After all, this is what all the YouTube tech reviewers were ranting about how the M2 chips were that much more faster than the M1s. However, in my tests, this was actually not the case. It actually felt slightly worse, at least for the MacBook Pro version that I had. So I don't know if there's some throttling going on in the laptops that doesn't happen in the Mac Studio version of the chips, but that might be something to note if it matters to you. I don't have the money nor interest to go buy every version of the M2 in the Studio and MacBook Pro versions to do comparative testing to see if there actually is throttling. After all, I've got a business to run, but this was just my experience so far. In the 362.8 million polygon scene, it was very laggy. You were able to sculpt, but not really rotate much. And I would have to say it wasn't even workable. You'd have to hide your other subtools to rotate around the subtool that you're working on at an acceptable sort of rate. However, remember that these subtools are ridiculously subdivided beyond what the average model would be, and beyond what I would normally work with professionally. This was just for the sake of testing. So when the subtools were at a more reasonable poly count, the performance was actually fine. Now, I decided to keep going for the heck of it and subdivide all of the subtools to the max to max out the total poly count that I could possibly get with this. I ended up actually with a scene that was over 700 million polygons spread over 12 different subtools. And amazingly, ZBrush didn't crash, but also it really didn't rotate either. It was actually totally unusable, but also I'd never actually create a model like this for production anyways. However, if you isolated your subtools, even in that 700 million polygon scene, you could rotate and sculpt no problem, even on meshes above 80 million polygons. So I guess you could do that as a workaround in a pinch if you needed to work on models that high. Let's talk next about the decimation, first with the M1 Max. The model was totaling about 107 million polygons at that point. And then I decided to run some decimation tests. Since a lot of my professional work is doing sculpts for 3D printing for toys and action figures, and you have to decimate your STL files to send them to print. So this is something where increased performance would actually be really helpful with my professional work. So I started by decimating the 35 million polygon body subtool for this model, and the pre-processing took about 6 minutes and 15 seconds. Not bad, but also not stellar, right? I then decimated it, and it did it in 22 seconds, which is great, right? So I'd say that for doing decimation for 3D print work, the M1 Max gives respectable performance, but not top of the class. Perhaps if you got the Ultra or maybe more RAM, it might give you some better results than what I got, but that was my result. Let's talk about now the M2 Max for decimation. Now, running the decimation test, here was actually my results and where things started to get interesting. When pre-processing the 35 million poly body of the Dragon, the CPU was maxed out and the GPU was sitting at around 33% usage, possibly because of OBS running in the background, right? Also, you started to hear the fan spin up. It wasn't crazy loud like my PC laptop, but definitely audible. Those YouTube tech reviewers who boast that you can never hear the fans, I don't think that they really know what they're talking about. Or maybe they've never actually used it for production work. I don't know. Because I definitely heard the fans spin up on both the M1 Max Studio and the M2 Max MacBook Pro, at least in my work. And I'll say though that to its credit, it is definitely a lot less and quieter than any PC laptop that I've ever used, right? However, if you push the CPU and the GPU either with a tough video render or a CPU intensive sort of decimation, you'll hear the fans spin up on the MacBook Pro. Now, the Mac Studio though, did sometimes spin the fans up, but slightly less, at least in my experience, than I'm experiencing with the MacBook Pro. So I definitely think that there's some cooling differences between these two computers. Anyways, back to the test. The pre-processing for the decimation took 6 minutes and 58 seconds. So it was actually a little slower than the M1 Max Studio. And this was kind of surprising to me. But again, it pointed to the fact that perhaps the Apple Silicon chips in the laptop versions are not 100% exactly the same performance as in the studio version. And I have to think that the thermals play a role in that, right? So if I was to guess, I'd guess that the 14-inch MacBook Pro would perform worse than the 16-inch MacBook Pro because of the thermal performance. And it just goes to show that there are always trade-offs. If you want portability, you have to trade off something. Either it's going to be performance or battery life or something. And that's true for Macs and for PCs. Now, back to the test. The decimation took 18 seconds. So while the pre-processing was slightly slower, the decimation was actually definitely faster than the M1 Max with those 2 extra cores. So that made a difference. And this shows me that it's more so the sustained stress that causes the M2 in the laptop version, at least, to throttle down. But for burst performances, like short bursts, it's actually faster than the M1. And this might not happen with the studio version of the M2, but I can't confirm that as I don't own one. So at least for me and my type of work, this is fine. Remember that the tests that I'm running here are actually pushing well beyond what I'd be normally doing for production work for clients. I almost never will have a single mesh that's more than 40 million polygons, and most of my ZBrush projects are under 200 million polygons, even for the complex models. So while it's nice to boast about specs and how many polygons your computer can push, realistically, you have to ask yourself this: how many do you actually need for your work? Okay, let me give you some concluding thoughts and important notes. So in summary, right, both the M1 and the M2 Max chips can handle quite a bit of ZBrush work and could be used for professional work. I've been using them with no problem. The main reason for me selling the Mac Studio and upgrading to the M2 Max MacBook Pro was that I needed something portable. Since I also, in addition to doing ZBrush sculpting and so on in my business, do a lot of video work, and I wanted a laptop to go with me on my shoots. Also, being able to be mobile with my work and realistically do work on a plane or at a coffee shop was a huge appeal for me. As we know, most PC laptops with those beefy kind of specs are gonna be faster for sure, but they really don't have great battery life. And I'm still blown away by the MacBook's battery life. I can easily get a full day of work on one charge. And being able to sculpt in ZBrush or edit 4K video on the go is actually pretty great. Now, some important notes and tips though. Okay, I did find that sometimes ZBrush has to pack or dump the memory when working with extremely large files. I was working on a sculpt of a mech with a lot of different parts for a client, and ZBrush had to actually delete the undo history because it ran out of RAM. So if that's a concern for you, you might want to consider upgrading to the 64 gigabytes of unified memory. However, this is not to say that it was unusable. It worked actually just fine for me and completed that project without any issues. Once you're saving iteratively, which you should be, there's not much issue there. If I had the extra budget, I would have probably gone for the extra RAM, but the vast majority of my work that I do, I hardly run into this problem. Now, connected with this is the issue of using swap memory. Sometimes the computer runs out of available RAM and it'll write to the swap memory that is the solid state drive, the internal drive. And it gives you this little pop-up warning when this happens. However, this also hasn't really affected my work even when it does happen. The SSDs on this Mac is actually very, very fast. But again, if you'd like to totally avoid this, then upgrade the RAM. It's just gonna cost you a pretty penny since you pay a premium with Apple for more memory, and there's just no way to upgrade it yourself after the fact. I'd say that for the majority of people, 32 gigabytes should be fine. You should, however, upgrade the SSD to at least 1 terabyte in my opinion. These days, 512 gigabytes will fill up way too fast with apps and stuff that you'll need on your internal drive. Beyond that though, I'd say buy a couple of external Thunderbolt SSDs and save some money on storage space. I've been working off of these for 3D and video work with no problem, and they are way cheaper per gigabyte than Apple's internal storage pricing. So do yourself a favor. I've both used the SanDisk Extreme, the 2 terabyte, and also the Samsung T7 2 terabyte drive. And while I know that there are some minor differences in read and write speeds, honestly, I can't tell the difference between them. If you want to get the absolute most out of the M2 Max chip, it seems like you should get the Max Studio, since the M1 version that I had didn't throttle, right? I'd assume that the M2 version also wouldn't throttle because of the superior thermal performance. However, even with the slightly throttled performance on the MacBook Pro, for me anyways, it hasn't really been that much of an issue using it for professional work. The other pros that come with it, like the portability and the battery life, actually make up for that lack for me. And at the end of the day, it's really a great machine that's capable of quite a lot. I've been using the M2 Max Macbook Pro for over 4 months now on professional client work in both 3D sculpting and video editing, and I definitely don't regret my choice. It has proven actually to be the right tool, for me anyways, for the work that I currently do. And there may come a day when I'll need to upgrade to something else, but that's kind of how business in the tech industry is, right? So don't get hung up on it. It may be that it will be the right tool for you or not. And that depends on your use case and what features are important to you. At the end of the day, these are just tools. So get the one that works and fits your budget, get off YouTube and get off the comment debates and go create something awesome.